folks, again. You know, Larry could have composed a quick verse there. That would have been good, Larry, if you'd just done that and typed it in real quick. We could have just sung it, but as Dee was ready, she was ready to go. It's so good to be with you, folks. Appreciate the smiles. Appreciate those that have the joy of God on their countenance this morning. It's been a couple months, and perhaps some of you weren't here, but I had the chance to be able to speak for you folks when Rand was interiming on, I think we talked about evolution and we talked about the early earth. I think are the two sessions we've done so far. And today we're going to visit a little bit on the topic of the flood, Noah's flood. And our topic is faith, flood, and fossils. Faith, flood, and fossils. Here's what I want to go through with you folks this morning. A more reasonable faith. This presumes that both creation and evolution, both positions of origins, are involving faith. And you might recall this from our first session. We have hard science like chemistry and biology that we can go into the lab. We can actually, run a chemical reaction and somebody else can replicate it. We can observe it multiple times. That is hard, verifiable science. And then we have the softer science of historical science, where we're kind of looking back and we're trying, almost like a detective, to take clues like fossils, like this T-Rex tooth here. And we're trying to say, okay, what happened? And we can't repeat it. We can't really observe it. We're just looking at remnants and relics for an event that happened in the past that we can't observe and we can't replicate. And so it's not hard science. It's rather positions of speculation, and in many cases, even faith. I have to have faith that God created the earth. I can't say, hey, God, can you poke your head into my living room here and create something for me? Can you wind me back in a time machine so I can see you do it? Probably God's not going to do that. So it takes faith, right? But we would say it's a very reasonable faith. And then I want to talk about the analysis of the Genesis flood record in the Bible. We'll just kind of start marching through the flood record in the Bible and in Genesis. And then finally, I want to give you some scientific evidence for geological catastrophe. That is, the big rock layers that we see round about us, things like Niagara Falls and Grand Canyon, happened quickly as a result of a catastrophe, rather than slow, gradual processes over millions, or as JR said, billions even of years. Okay. As we think about this topic of a more reasonable faith, here's a definition of faith. I'm going to read this, and I want to see if you like this definition by Bertrand Russell. We may define faith as a firm belief in something for which there is no evidence. We may define faith as a firm belief in something for which there's no evidence. How do you like that definition of faith? What do you think? You like that? Why not? There is evidence. Very good. I think that's a good definition of insanity myself. There is evidence. I gave you evidence last time. We'll give you some more evidence today. Again, just because it's not hard science and I can't go back and see the Genesis flood doesn't mean there's no evidence for it. Our faith is a very reasonable faith. So we're going to skip away from Bertrand Russell, who's a very famous atheist. But we're going to use the biblical definition of faith. And in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, God defines faith, at least biblical faith, this way. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Let's just kind of tease apart this verse for just a moment this morning. Faith is the substance. What's substance? Anybody ever had chemistry class? What's a substance? Matter. What's your name, brother? I forgot. Alan. Thank you, Alan. Alan's right. When you start looking at fundamental elements of matter, okay, hydrogen, oxygen, remember your periodic table of the elements, and you combine them together, you get what we call a substance. If I take hydrogen, 2 parts oxygen, and put them together, I get what substance? Water. If I combine carbon and oxygen together, I get what? Hopefully not carbon monoxide. Hopefully carbon dioxide, right? So a substance is a scientific word. Now watch this. You have this very interesting juxtaposition here. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. So we have this very concrete word, like I can go into a laboratory and touch a substance. And yet the author of the Hebrews says it's the substance of things hoped for. Hope we think of as a little bit more speculative. Somebody comes in, I hope to be a millionaire someday. Hope is stuff that we haven't gotten and maybe we're anticipating, but there's some speculation and some uncertainty of it, right? Well, biblically, the word hope is a little bit stronger. In the Bible, the word hope is a confident expectation. So it's a little different than like, I hope to win the lottery someday. But it's things that like heaven that we haven't seen. And things like being more mature in Christ, or maybe hoping to win some souls, or hoping real soon to have a pastor for Community Baptist Church. We're praying with you guys, and I just want to encourage you this morning, keep on keeping on. God, this is God's church, and he's going to bring the right man at the right time. That's hope. Those are hope, things we hope for. Here's what I think the author of the Hebrews is saying. Our faith is so strong, it's so solid, it's not like a leap in the dark. It's so strong we can almost like put our hand out and touch it. That's the nature of biblical faith. And then the author of the Hebrews says, it's the evidence of things not seen. Well, we use that word evidence in the scientific arena, but there's another arena that uses it even more. What's that? Legal. Who said legal? JR, you're the man. They present evidence in court, right? And it's the weight of the evidence that might carry the case either to convict someone or to free someone as innocent, right? And so when you think of evidence, but look at this, evidence of things not seen. I've got my friend Jeremiah with me today. He was nice enough to come along and help keep me awake on the way. But let's just say that Jeremiah is here and he's on court, and in his court, and I'm the judge, and he's got an attorney there. And let's just say that Larry comes up, and Larry says, I didn't see anything about this guy Jeremiah who's accused, but as far as I'm concerned, he looks guilty.
I agree.
Now, if he's got a decent attorney, what's the attorney going to say? Objection. We don't want your opinion on my client. We want to hear what's the evidence. I mean, have you seen footprints? Have you seen, a DNA analysis? Or, did you eyewitness something? I don't want your opinion, right? And yet here we have this interesting juxtaposition of words, the evidence of things not seen. Here's what the author, I think, is trying to say. Our faith, biblical faith, is so strong that even though we haven't seen God, we haven't seen heaven, you could go into a court of law and you could bet your life on it. That's how strong biblical faith is. You see, my friends, at no point in the Bible does God say, just take a leap in the dark, hopefully get the right religion, just... No. Isaiah 1:18 says, come now and let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool. Our faith is very reasonable, and God does give evidences. And nowhere does God say, hey, just check your brain at the door and just come into the church. No. God gave us our brain. Right, Alan? God wants us to use our brain. And so we don't want to elevate our brain up to the point where we're rationalists and everything has to make sense to me or else I'm not going to believe it. That's wrong too, because we can't understand everything about God. God's infinite, and that's okay. But God does want us to engage our brain. And we read about Paul going into the synagogues and proving, a very strong Greek word, proving this is very Christ. See? So the nature of biblical faith is a very firm thing, is what I'm trying to start you off with here. Now in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3, we read this, through faith we understand the worlds were framed by the word of God. So the things which were seen were not made of things which do appear. Things didn't come from something else, and then something else. It wasn't evolved, but rather they were not made of things which do appear. In other words, literally creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, boom, fast. We had talked about some of this in our previous session, so maybe this slide will bring it back to you. But we talked about the creation model and the evolution model. And the evolution model, things come from stuff that does appear. It's a natural origin. One thing changes to another thing slowly over long periods of time. In the creation model, we have things happening abruptly, right? In the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth, boom, out of nothing, right? So we've talked about that a little bit. Last time, if you remember that we visited together, we talked about decreasing order versus increasing order. Is it goo to you via the zoo, or did God make it perfect and slowly it's going downhill? Does anybody remember? Were fossil things bigger or smaller? They were bigger and healthier and lived longer in the past, right? God had made this beautiful environment on planet Earth. Our sin destroyed it. So we talked about this second thing a little bit. Today I want to talk and visit a little bit about this last two key differences between the creation model and the evolution model. That is, did the big rock formations, the many layers that are in our earth, did these things happen slowly, gradualism, uniformitarian, that is, things are very consistent year after year after year? Basically, the processes that we see today, did they form these big rock formations, like the Grand Canyon, for example? Or was there catastrophes, unlike what typically happens every day, over shorter time scales? So here's the two models. Big catastrophe over short time scales, or rather normal processes, but over long periods of time. You following me? You with me? Okay. So let's talk about how the evidence lines up on it. Now, again, looking in Hebrews chapter 11, we very quickly see the author of the Hebrews cite a particular man as an example of faith. And in verse 7, he says, by faith, Noah. So Noah is lifted up as this great man of faith. Being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house. How would you like to be told by God? Go out and work for the next 100 years, roughly, and build a huge boat when it had never rained before. Because I'm going to flood the whole earth. And Noah obediently and in faith goes out and obeys God. Can you imagine the Pangea Times coming along to interview Noah? Excuse me, Noah, can we talk to you for a few minutes? It's been three decades here. You've been building this ark. How you doing on it? And sticking the microphone. He was the laughing stock of his day. What are you building this boat for? Does it have an engine, Noah? No. Does it have a rudder? No. Well, how are you going to go anywhere? Well, I'm not going to go set the float. Well, why so big? You're going to put all these animals on it. You want to come? No, I don't want to come. You're crazy, right? I have a replica of the ark. Come look at this afterwards. A guy in Pennsylvania makes these things, puts a lot of effort into just exactly modeling it right after the biblical proportions, and he's got 2x2 kind of coming. Any of you guys been to the Ark Encounter out in, you've been there to Kentucky? Uh-huh. You want to go, Dee? Okay, I was just there last week. It is awesome. It really, when you come over that hill, you know it's big, right? You just, in your mind, you know it's big. But when you come over that hill, it's like, it just hits you. The thing is enormous. It's just amazing. It's a jaw dropper. They really have, and everything is just excellent quality. It's like Disney World quality. It's just really well done. And so it's really pretty amazing. But this ark, I mean, and people mock. People make fun of this thing. They laugh at it. And it's become kind of the focal point of modern geologists' attack on the scriptural account. Why did geologists like to mock the flood or mock the ark? And why are they so opposed to it? Who knows? Well, yeah, they don't believe. Okay, so they just basically oppose the whole Bible. Yeah, because they don't believe. But why especially this? Yeah, they don't believe in the worldwide flood.
It goes against their beliefs.
It does go against their beliefs. In what specific way? What does the concept of the flood really destroy in their belief? Okay, so the foundations, creation and the flood are really kind of foundational concepts, aren't they, in the Bible? Follow me, though. When you start looking at these rock layers, okay, in the lower rock layers we have invertebrates, no backbone, right? And that's maybe, Cambrian. Before that, you mostly just got blue-green algae. So the lower layers here, we have things like this trilobite here, okay, or this nautiloid. These are some extinct mollusks. And so these would be no backbone. And then the Devonian, we have these fishes. And the Permian, we have these amphibians. And eventually, supposedly, the Mesozoic, where the great reptiles all evolved. And then finally, here in the Cenozoic, you have man. And so the whole, and it's not always this way. It's not this clean. But there's a general trend, okay, in the fossil record that the lowest things are more simpler, and then you got the fishes, and then you got the amphibians and the reptiles, and then the mammals tend to be more to the top. Okay, that's just general trend. That's supposedly the best evidence of billions of years of evolution. This evolved to that of Nemo. Nemo, he has a very important part to play in the whole thing. And then eventually, you know, the great Jurassic, Cretaceous, and Grandpa, right? And we all came from, you know, something like, you know, it's Goody UV of the zoo. That's supposedly, and so if you say that all happened in one flood, guess what happens to the whole theory of evolution? It goes down the toilet with it, right? So that's why they are opposed to it. And yet, did you know there is a universal flood belief in the tradition and language of every major nationality? India, Sioux Indians, Greeks, Norse, Sumerians, Egyptians, many more. Over 270 people groups have a flood tradition. Now, do you think that's all just an accident? Or do you think the knowledge of the flood, which is like this momentous thing in, you know, the early culture after Noah and his 3 sons, and they begin to, you know, the population grows, and then God confuses their languages at Babel, and they start to spread out over the earth. They're carrying this knowledge of the flood with them. And it kind of becomes part of the traditions of these different people groups as they settle different areas. And so here's the Hawaiians. This is before the missionaries came. Long before the death of Kunahana, the first man, the world became a wicked and terrible place to live. There was one good man left. His name was Nu'u. Kind of interesting, huh? He made a great canoe with a house on it and filled it with animals. The waters came up over all the earth and killed all the people. Only Nu'u and his family were saved. So they had this knowledge, this tradition. And obviously it's not exactly right, but it's kind of interesting. Then you have the Toltec Indians of ancient Mexico. They said the first world lasted 1,716 years. By the way, if you add up the genealogies in the Bible, that's almost exactly, right around 1700, the number of years we would say there was before the flood. Very, very close. And then it was destroyed by waters that submerged the highest mountains by 15 cubits. Very interesting, that's right on. Only one family named Cox survived. Well, they got the name a little bit kerflooey there, but pretty close. The best known record outside the Bible is the Gilgamesh epic. And this is a cuneiform tablet that was discovered in ancient Babylonia. And it tells about how Gilgamesh took his family of 8, very interesting, with 2 of each kind of the world's creatures and saved the world's creatures during the Great Flood. There's so many similarities between the two that some of the skeptics have said, well, maybe Moses or whoever wrote Genesis stole the idea from the Babylonians. It couldn't be the other way around. No, that couldn't be. It had to be that, you know, we got it from the Babylonians. But that idea has come upon some hard times because recently an even older cuneiform tablet, I have a picture of it there, called the Nippur tablet. It's older than the Gilgamesh tablet. And it has, so the older is usually thought of as more accurate because over time things get exaggerated, just like JR's fish stories. But over time, you know, things kind of grow in size a little bit. But so this older one is exactly like the Bible. It doesn't differ at all. So yeah, the Bible is right on and it's accurate. The oldest civilization in the world is the Chinese. Now the Chinese have some crazy old books. And you may have had to study some old stories in English literature. Maybe you read Beowulf or something like this, and you're like, oh man, it's old English, it's so hard to understand. The Chinese have 1,000-year-old stories. I mean 1,000 BC, 3,000-year-old stories. Like this Shu Jing story and the Huanazi. And this talks about a flood, when the poles of the world broke apart and the floods rose above the hills, covered the mountains, drowned all the living things. In the midst of this calamity, a hero named Nuwa, check that out, huh? That's really close. Nuwa appeared to replenish the earth. Now, guys, this is 3,000-year-old stories. And they just happen to have the name that close? Pretty remarkable. But here's the really interesting thing about Chinese. They don't write with letters. You understand that, right? They draw pictures. And they combine different pictures together to get more complicated words. Like we might take a couple words and put them together and make a compound word. Okay, that's how they do. And there are some even older texts. Like we just have fragments and bits that's so old it's mostly fallen apart. And by just looking at these old pictures, we can glean some knowledge. For example, here is the bronzeware and the oracle bone. Now we're talking about 2500 BC. We're almost talking about, that's getting close to Babel. Like this is the first people groups coming from Babel and settling in what is today China. Very crazy old. They're writing on bone, they're writing on bronze. And this is their word for to build, right there. It's a combination of a boat, a roof, and an announcement. So when they were thinking to build something big, they would combine a boat, a roof, and an announcement. Does that sound like something biblical? Here is their word for ship or a large boat. It's a combination of boat, the number 8, that's the number 8, and a mouth or a person. So 8 people, now we wouldn't think of that as a particularly big ship, but there's something in their knowledge that they're referencing here that 8 people on a boat made a very large ship. Now here is their word for violent. It's a water stream with 2 hands pointing upwards, ejecting out all the way up to the sun. So again, you see this knowledge of the flood. One more. This is their word for formerly, or like back in the old days. And they have a slight deviation between the oracle and the bronzeware. One of them shows it as a flood covering everything up to the sun. The other one is showing it covering everything and only reflecting the sun. Same idea, basically the whole world covered with water. So this knowledge of the flood that's in all these ancient cultures. Well, when you start talking seriously about the flood, the number one question I get asked is this: how did Noah fit all the animals on the ark? I mean, we got literally millions of species. How could he possibly fit them all on there, right? And people are thinking dinosaurs and stuff like this. Well, number one, God brought them. Noah didn't have to go slinking around with a tranquilizer gun. Boom! Okay, Shem, haul them aboard. God's bringing them, right? So God's kind of in charge of this thing. He's got his hands on it. And God's probably not going to bring the big old grandpapa, sauropod dinosaur. He's going to bring a baby one. It's much easier to handle, eats less food, and can live for a lot longer and reproduce after the flood, right? So God's got his fingers in these things. And so God's bringing them. And we have to understand the concept of kind, K-I-N-D. This is an important creation concept. You might have lots of varieties of cats and lots of varieties of dogs, but there only had to be 2 dogs and 2 cats on the ark. You with me? You don't have to have lions and cheetahs and pumas and house cats, and that's a naked cat. They really do exist, naked cats. You don't have to have, dingoes and wolves and coyotes and foxes and Great Danes and German Shepherds and St. Bernards and poodles and all these. No, 2 dogs, 2 cats. And the genetic capacity for variation afterwards would have allowed all these different, species to kind of come into existence over time. Does that make sense? Okay. So that helps us to understand it's a lot fewer, because only the kinds. We see this very important concept in Genesis chapter 1. God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, cattle after their kind, everything that creeps on the earth after his kind. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, tree yielding fruit whose seed was in itself after his kind. This is an important biblical concept, the kind. And we have variation. You could call it microevolution. I don't even like to use that word. It's genetic diversification, maybe, after the flood. So God brings them. Many don't have to come. Did we have to have a goldfish bowl on the ark? No, the fish just swimming around, right? A lot of them didn't have to come. Large animals could be taken as babies. Provisions could be stored for those who did not hibernate. A lot of animals can go into dormancy when climatic conditions get bad. Bears do, and a lot of others do. And then understand, Noah's Ark was huge. I mean, you look at the size of a football field. That's the biblical dimensions of this thing. And it's just a big barge. It doesn't have to have an engine, doesn't have to have a sail, doesn't have to go anywhere, just to float. And so no propulsion, no steering, excuse me, just floats. Now, the analysis was done in the classic book, The Genesis Flood by Morris and Whitcomb. It says there are 2.5 million macroscopic living creatures on the earth. 60% of those are aquatic, so they don't have to be on the ark. Of the 40% that are left, 70% of those are insects. Now, they may have floated around in some logs. Maybe some of them were on some of the hides of the elephants or the hippos, but he didn't worry about the insects. And then there's only a few thousand kinds, there's that word, mostly smaller than a dog. The capacity of the ark was equivalent to 522 railroad stock cars 73 such stock cars could have carried all these animal kinds. So there's plenty of room, not just for the animals, but for food, for Noah, for his family, on the ark. Okay, that's a more reasonable faith. Any questions on that? You all with me? Okay. Let's jump into this. Let's open our Bibles to the book of Genesis. Let's talk about analysis of the Genesis flood record in the Bible. And we're going to begin by taking a look at this timeline of the flood. Turn to Genesis chapter 5. But if you look biblically, it divides pretty neatly into three categories. The onslaught, that's the waters coming up. The prevailing, now the waters aren't coming up or down, they're just staying. And then finally the abatement. Now I'm using biblical words here, but onslaught, prevailing, and abatement. That's how it kind of divides up. And in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, we read this. Genesis 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. What are the two sources of the flood water? Coming up and coming down. The fountains of the great deep and these windows of heaven. Okay, more specifically, what are those? Rain. We read it rained 40 days and 40 nights. Now, the whole flood was about a year, but just intense rain for a little more than a month. Now, if you remember our presentation last time, we think perhaps there was this water vapor canopy that surrounded the earth. Remember that? Some of you guys that were here, some of you weren't here. And perhaps at this point you've got a comet, a meteor coming in, and it's slamming into the earth. We do know we have these massive just craters where some meteor or something hit, like down the Yucatan Peninsula and in Australia and different other places on the earth. And so maybe that's what caused the collapse of this water vapor canopy, and so you had this torrential rain. And that also caused a lot of these craters. We know that there's a slight wobble to the earth. So the earth is tilted axis, which gives us the seasons, and but like a top that's spinning, if you bump it, it will have its turn, but then it might also have a slight wobble. We call it precession. And the earth has a little bit of a precession. The axis wanders a little bit as it goes around, as if it's been struck. Very interestingly, if you look at the ages of the long-lived patriarchs after the flood, it drops off very quickly. People just aren't living as long after the flood. Something happened, and perhaps that's because that water vapor canopy was dispersed. And then the fountains of the great deep. Now, the fountains of the great deep is also pretty interesting because we think that God stored up water under the crust of the earth. Remember, it didn't rain till the flood. And yet we see a river comes out of Eden, right? So how do you get a river coming out of the Garden of Eden if you don't have rain? Well, it says God watered with dew, but that's not enough to make a river. But very likely God had stored under the earth a lot of water under pressure, kind of like if you've ever been to Yellowstone, Old Faithful, right? There's water down there still today in some places under pressure, and it comes squirting up pretty often. Well, probably it was a lot more on the early earth. And so there was this geyser activity that was regularly causing rivers and streams. Now, we believe also there was one continent in the pre-flood world. Remember that? We talked about that. If you were to suck all the water out of the oceans, in the middle of the Atlantic, you would have this transatlantic ridge. What is that? Well, it would be a little bit like if you had a ball. What's your name again? Drew. Let's say that Drew has a soccer ball, and it's an old ball. It's a little bit tired, and he lines up right in front of the goal, and Drew pulls back, and with all his might, he goes, bam, and just kicks that ball. And the ball's just had one kick too many, and he goes, pop. At the point of his kick, it might start to rip, but then because of the pressure in the ball, that rip spreads and kind of goes right along the whole line of the ball. And that's kind of what happens. There may have been a meteor that hit one place, but because of this water that was under pressure, it literally split the seam of the earth. Like, look at this, like a tear. You see that? And it follows the contour of the continents. So what was one continent got broken up and started to move apart. And they're still moving a little bit today, but not much. But that would have been pretty tumultuous to be living during those times. You know, if you think about water coming spewing out from under the earth, I've got a little animation here. You can kind of get an idea, but there's just the earth's breaking up. The continents are breaking apart, and this water literally is ripping trees and rocks and dirt up into the air. And these subterranean chambers bursting would have been just terrifying to be on planet Earth at that time. People were starting to believe Noah about that, that something bad was happening, right? Well, scientifically, the continental plates getting broken apart would have caused this dirty rain, water going up into the atmosphere, landing elsewhere, carrying dirt and rocks and stones with it. You'd have a lot of volcanic eruptions and earthquake activity because you're just breaking up, you know, earth plates, and of course it's causing earthquakes and activities. Well, once you start getting earthquakes, you're going to get tsunamis, and water starts moving at high rates of speed and carrying a lot of debris with it, which is going to wreak mayhem when those tsunamis hit the continents. And as the tsunamis start getting through the ocean, carrying this debris, what's the first thing that's going to be buried? If a tsunami's carrying a bunch of just mud and dirt and sand, before it even gets to land, what's the first thing that's going to get buried? Fish.
Sea creatures.
Marine organisms, right? Stuff like this little nautiloid here. He's just sitting there minding his own business, also, boop, he's covered, right? Because of these waves from this earthquake activity. So if you look at all the fossils in all the world, 95% are marine invertebrates, shellfish. 95% of what's left is algae and plant fossils. Only 1/100% of our fossils are vertebrates, and that is mostly fish. So the big picture of all the fossils that are buried in the ground is a marine cataclysm. That's the big picture of the fossil record. Oh, we got dinosaurs, we got mammals, we got some interesting stuff, but the big picture is marine organisms. That's mostly what the fossil record was. And interestingly enough, these invertebrates, these clams, are all fossilized closed. I dug this one out of the Paluxy River area down in Glen Rose, Texas. Why is it significant that they are buried closed? Who knows? Who said they're alive? Gold star for that young lady. They were buried alive. So if you want to make the case that these fossils that are buried down there over millions of years in these different layers just died and fell to the bottom of a lake and they got buried, well, guess what happens to a clam when it dies? If you've cooked them, you know they go, bleh, they're a big muscle, they just relax and open up. So you can eat them, right? These were they probably died from fossilization. That's how fast it was. This tsunami comes over, buries them in the pressure, they just literally get fossilized like instantly, virtually. Catastrophe, evidence of catastrophe. By the way, we find these things on the tops of all the mountains. Figure that out. And then we read in Genesis 7:19, the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole of heaven were covered. So now it's not just the low areas, now it's coming up on the continents. It's coming up, and probably by this time Noah's Ark starts to get flowing, and starts to get floating, and you see some people making their way to high ground, and they're kind of thinking, oops, we may have missed something. Yeah, we may have missed out. But you have these massive waves coming up on the continents, and it's starting to get debris and starting to haul down. And scientifically, we've got a lot of interesting stuff going on. We've got tremendous amounts of erosion. We've got the low-lying areas that were once swampy areas are now being covered with water and debris that's getting eroded down. Well, what's living in swamps? Drew, what lives in a swamp? What do you think? Amphibians. Very good answer. What's an amphibian? Lizards, frogs, alligators, reptiles are living in the swamps, right? What else? You got to name my favorite thing. Come on. Snakes? Yes. I'm waiting for somebody to say it. My favorite stuff in all the world. Dinosaurs! Somebody comes through. Alan, thank you. What would we be without you? So on the bottom, you got these ocean creatures. The next thing that's getting buried is all these reptiles and amphibians, right? That live in the swamps. Before the high ground. And some of the things that are a little more intelligent, like the mammals and maybe a little more mobile, we're getting out of here. Some of these big dinosaurs are like, duh, bloop, and they get covered, right? You know? They're big, but they don't have much brains. And so they're just sitting there. And then debris pools. You've seen this in the springtime when there's a large runoff, maybe a rainstorm, and it's carrying stuff with it, somebody's old Coke can, and maybe some sticks and leaves, and it's carrying it down, and it's kind of floating around like that, right? And so these debris pools form. And then it says in Genesis 7:20, 15 cubits upward to the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. So now everything's covered. By the way, why go 15 cubits over the mountain? I mean, why the extra? Well, the ark was 30 cubits tall. And if it's sitting halfway down in the water, God wanted to make sure that there was enough water that it would be able to clear the highest mountains as it's floating around. And God had this all under control. So yeah, he had Noah do a lot of stuff, but literally God had his fingerprints all over this. So masses of vegetation are carried downstream. They're buried by dirt. Rising floodwaters cover the higher grounds. Now some of those larger and more mobile creatures are caught and buried. We have mammals and people. And we have a very major feature of the fossil record, fossil graveyards. This is so significant that leading museums, I'm talking the Harvard Museum if you go down to Boston, or the Peabody Museum, the Yale Peabody Museum in Connecticut, or the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, and I've been to all these, they actually will show pictures of fossil graveyards. What's a fossil graveyard? Well, it's where a whole lot of stuff gets swept into one place and buried, just conglomerated all in a big heap. Now, why is that? If it happens slowly over millions of years, why would literally thousands of animals all come to one place like, I think I'm about ready to die. Let me go take a little pilgrimage over here. We all die, and that's our cemetery. They all go over there and die. It doesn't make any sense, right? But what if you had waves sweeping across the continents, carrying debris and pushing stuff in front? We've seen some minor, like there was a tsunami that hit, was it Japan, right? I don't know, what, 20-some years ago. And, it just swept all this stuff, gathered people and debris and animals and pets, and then just whoop, buried it all over here. And they had to dig through just to even find, like, the people and stuff. And so we see, for example, in the Gobi Desert, it says, this quote says, it's like a paradise for paleontologists. Freshly exposed skeletons sometimes look more like the recent remains of a carcass than an 80-million-year-old fossil. Well, I have news for Mr. Evolutionist Michael Novacek. Maybe it's not an 80-million-year-old fossil, but here's some pictures of some gobies. You see these reddish, and you got tigers, saber-toothed tigers, and dinosaurs, and crocodilians, all kind of buried together, literally by the millions. And that's not unusual. Down in the Carolinas, they had the South Carolina Ashley beds. They had hadrosaurs and deers and plesiosaurs and dogs and iguanodons and sheep and woolly mammoths, all jumbled together, all buried there. Here's a picture of a fossil graveyard. Look at all these different creatures all jammed in together in one place. Here's another one. Everything you see there, literally everything is bone. Everything is bone. And then we read in Genesis 7:24, and the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. So now we've stopped the waters coming up, and now the waters are just resting on the land. Like they're not going up, they're not going down for literally 6 months. And can you imagine Noah and his 3 sons and their wives? They're all in the ark, and the ark's just going up and down, and Noah's thinking, okay, Lord, any day now, it'd be nice to kind of get off. Cabin fever setting in. How many times can you pay tiddlywinks with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? Sometimes you guys think, oh, man, I'm getting cabin fever just because I've been stuck in, working in the office out of home. But can you imagine 6 months on this ark with a bunch of stinky animals, right? Well, some very fascinating stuff's going on scientifically. During those 6 months, the pressure of all that water pressing down on these newly buried sediments, under the sediments is the fossils, the creatures, right? That's transforming these things into fossils. Look, it doesn't take millions of years to turn things into a fossil. It can happen fast if it gets buried and has pressure. Here's a megalodon that's just giant shark tooth. This is real, by the way. This is a real megalodon tooth. Can you imagine a whole row of those things? You can feel the serrated edge. Come check these things out afterwards. I've got coprolite here. Who remembers what coprolite is? Yes. Dinosaur poop. Very good. Gold star for you, young man. Okay, come check those out afterwards. Coal and oil, the fossil fuels are being created. And regular tidal flow would have formed thousands of fine layers. So you have a tidal flow from the moon moving around, and it picks up and lays down layers and stirs them up again and lays them down again. And we see areas in the world where there's these literally thousands of layers, very fine layers. But fossil fuels, coal, for example, we have 20,000 square miles of black, pure bituminous coal in Montana and Wyoming. Here's a coal seam. It's up to 200 feet thick. You got 240 billion tons of coal in one place, the largest coal reserve in the world. Can you please show me anywhere on the face of the earth where anything like that is happening today? The evolutionists can't even show you a place where, given enough time, maybe something like that would happen. Because if you had an accumulation of coal things, which is plants and stuff that gets buried, it's not going to be pure. Over millions of years, you're going to have some volcano, you're going to have, some landslide, you're going to have dirt and rocks in there and stuff. This is pure coal. I mean, something happened so fast that before it could get anything to, unpurify it, took all this vegetation, buried it, pressurized it, and turned it into coal. 240 billion tons of coal. Massive catastrophe would be required. By the way, coal does not take millions of years to form. Oil does not take millions of years to form. Here's an article from the Pacific Northwest National Labs. These engineers working at this Department of Energy said they were able to transform harvested marine algae into crude oil in less than 1 hour. Just takes the right conditions. Lots of pressure, lots of heat, and you can do it fast. Let me tell you a story about nautiloids. This is cool. Nautiloid is this bashful-looking dude in the party hat up there. He's got a shell, has these different layers. They get a layer every year or so you can come count this afterwards and see how old this guy was when he passed away. But nautiloids were once thought to be pretty rare in the Grand Canyon. If you knew where to look, you could maybe find one. Here's a picture of a nautiloid fossil in the limestone layer of the Grand Canyon. You see that guy going side to side there like that? Okay, basically the same thing I got here, but it's going down like that. Okay. Steve Austin, who is a creationist, had a theory that the Grand Canyon happened rapidly as a result of the water flowing off the earth after the flood. And a geologist friend challenged him and said, okay, we understand how it could erode the canyon away, but how about the limestone layers? Those have to have millions of years to form. And so because of that challenge, Steve Austin began to study the red wall limestone in the Grand Canyon. And he began to look. He went up and down in one of these rafts, and everywhere you could get the red wall limestone, he went up and studied it. And what he found was it is full of nautiloid fossils. Now, most of the time, it's not going side to side like that. Most of the time, all you see is a circle because the nautiloid's going into the rock. You follow me? It's like it's been sliced by the canyon. And so it just looks like a circle. But if you were to dig back in the rock, he's going back into the rock. And come to find out, there are billions, with a B, of nautiloids. This was a mass kill event. The whole limestone layer got laid down very rapidly and caught up all these nautiloids. But the story gets even better. There's a preferred orientation. They're all facing the same direction. Remember, they're all going into the wall, which indicates that the flow was happening so quick it kind of aligned them to the flow and then buried them. So now there's no way it could happen slowly over millions of years. This had to happen fast and had to happen catastrophically. So now if you go to the Grand Canyon, they have a sign up that says, oh, there's all these, the creationists had to educate the park rangers that this was as a result of the flood. Well, Genesis chapter 8, we read that God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. That is, it began to run off. The waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of 150 days, the waters were abated. Now, this is the second most common question I get asked after I get asked, well, how do you feed all the animals? Where'd all the water go? Who knows the answer? Evaporation. Certainly evaporation would have been some of it, but it wouldn't have taken, 150 days. In other words, probably within 30 days, you'd have it evaporating off, maybe even rain a little more, and you start to have the normal hydrological cycle. Oceans, okay. You're on to something. Where in the oceans?
Low areas.
The low areas. So what a lot of people don't realize is there is enough water in the deep ocean basins right now that if you plow the continents into the ocean with a gigantic bulldozer, you could cover the whole earth with 1.5 miles of water, 8,000 feet. There's that much water in these deep ocean basins. You see, if you suck off all the water with a straw, that's what it would look like. You would go, let's see, here we are, Boston. Okay, you'd go off Cape Cod, you'd go shallow, 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 and boom! All of a sudden, it's this massive drop-off into what's called the abysmal plain. You see the Somme abysmal plain, the Hatteras abysmal plain. There's this crazy low area in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. That's where it ran off. And in fact, that area there, that drop-off, is probably right where it dropped at this point in the flood, at the end of the flood, and the waters ran off the continents into these deep ocean basins. You say, Dave, well, you sound pretty certain about that. Well, I am certain about it because the Bible says so. In Psalm 104, it says, at thy rebuke they fled, at the voice of thy thunder they hasted away. Verse 8 says, they go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys. The ESV translates that, the mountains rose up and the valleys sank down. That's what happened. That's what happened. So the uplift of the mountains, sinking of the ocean basins. Of course, the ark lands at that point. You have the erosion of the freshly laid sediments as the water's running off. It forms these canyons like the Grand Canyon. You had freezing at the poles and the higher elevations. You'd had a slight glacier after the flood. And Genesis 8:5 says that the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. And of course, you know the end of the story. There was a rainbow. God promised never to destroy the earth with water again, and people get off the boat, and all the animals get off the boat. And this ice age would have been the direct result of warm oceans, lots of evaporation, coming over cold continents, and it's snowing an awful lot. And we know that there was glaciers that went way down as far as Kansas, literally from Alaska all the way down to Kansas in this country. And so at one point, a lot of that ice would have been stored up on the continents, and you could have walked to places like maybe from Florida to Cuba, you know. But later on, the water levels came up when that ice melted. But this allowed the creatures coming off the ark to get to islands and to be able to get across things like from the Bering Strait, from Asia to the Americas and stuff like that. Okay? All right. We're almost done. Let's everybody stand up, stretch, stand up, turn around, get a big breath of air. Okay, we got to keep you awake here this morning. We're talking some science. Right, Drew? Okay, grab a seat. We're almost done. I just want to give you, in conclusion here, some key evidences for catastrophe. Remember we talked about the creation model, the evolution model. Was it slow and gradual over long periods of time, or was it short but catastrophic? Okay, I want to give you some evidence that the rock layers were formed catastrophically. So this would be a great place to take some notes. Someday somebody might ask you, well, how can you believe in a young earth? Well, I'm going to give you some key evidences right now. Number one, polystrate fossils. Polystrate fossils. Who knows what a polystrate fossil is? Yeah, go ahead.
It crosses multiple layers.
Very good. So poly, multiple, straight, strata, the rock layers. You have things like this tree that's going through multiple rock layers, and it's petrified. Now, do you mean to tell me that tree stood there for millions of years without rotting for these different rock layers to form gradually over millions of years? No, it doesn't make any sense, right? Here we have a tree. This is down in Cookeville, Tennessee. The bottom is coalified. It's a coal layer. The top is limestone. It's a petrified layer. And the evolutionists will tell you these layers are millions of years apart, and yet it's the same tree. Here's a cool one. Here's a nautiloid. I've got a nautiloid fossil here. It looks kind of like a spider of the ocean. It's kind of a small critter with lots of legs. And he's waking up one morning and he's stretching and he's saying, I got the feeling it's going to be a bad day. You ever feel like that? And he kind of gets out of bed and he starts walking, and along comes a wave with a lot of debris and just lands on him. He's like, I knew it was going to be a bad day. He kind of crawls out from under and goes, I'm glad that's behind me. He starts to walk. Along comes another wave, boom, and puts a whole bunch of mud on top of him. He's like, it's going to be a really bad day. He crawls out of that, and he's like to die. He's so tired. And then, boom, another wave comes, and he does die. It was a bad day. And we have in the top layer the actual trilobite fossil, and we see his tracks going down through the other 2 layers. Now, you mean to tell me that for millions of years he's been crawling through these solid rock layers? No, obviously this is happening fast, right? Boom, 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 and his trail has been captured there before it could get washed away. So this is the actual fossil of this trilobite. Polystrate fossils. Number 2, surface features. Little things like raindrops and ripples and tracks. Who's got a pet? Somebody's got a pet? What's your pet's name? Samson. Is it dog? Yep. Let's say Samson's out there after a rainstorm and he's running around in the mud, leaves some footprints. How long are those footprints going to last out there? Are they going to last for years? No, what's going to happen? They're going to get eroded away. They're going to get, maybe it'll just dry out and crumble, right? Or something else will step on it. In order to preserve very fine things like tracks and raindrops and ripples, you need to bring another layer in quickly and cover it before they can erode away, and it needs to harden. But we find lots of raindrops and ripples and tracks when we lift layers. And oh, look at all this stuff. Creatures are running around. And here's an example of some ripples, okay? But lots of this stuff, which shows you the next layer had to happen fast, because if that layer had been exposed there for even a few months, it would have been flattened out. So these layers have to happen fast, boom, 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 one right on top of the other to preserve stuff like that. Number 3, conforming layers. Now, don't get scared. You guys are smart. I'm going to give you a little geology here. Okay, you're going to get this. It's real simple. Conforming layers means that if it's flat, they all are flat. If they're curved, they all are curved. They conform to each other. Okay. So here you see these flat layers. Okay. Boom, 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 boom. Now, you can sometimes see this just driving down the road and looking, and they chopped, they dynamited to make the road, right? And you can see these layers. And sometimes they're all curved together. You should show your kids or grandkids this kind of stuff. What's that telling you when you see layer, layer, layer right hard against each other? Huh?
No, it's done.
It's happened quickly, but why? Why can't we deduce that it happened quickly? Remember, we're like detectives. We're looking at this evidence.
Straight line, you wouldn't see.
Yeah. Straight lines? What else? They're close together, okay. If this layer, this red layer on the bottom, had been sitting there for maybe a few centuries, what would happen?
It wouldn't be flat.
It wouldn't be flat. You're going to see brooks coming through. You're going to see trees digging down in some spots. You're going to see gophers going, I mean, literally in 10, 15 years, this was all going to happen. Much less millions of years. And yet we see solid rock, completely flat still, the next layer, the next layer. And so here's a whole mountain of conforming layers. And we don't see any biosoils. We don't see any erosion. You mean there's been no erosion for a million years? Like it should have been kind of like going downhill and maybe conglomerate over here, but obviously it was once up there, and it shouldn't be flat anymore. And so then clastic dikes. Now, don't get scared. Now, this is going to be easy. Sometimes we have, in the midst of these layers, a squirt up. Now, what's that? Well, it's like a toothpaste tube. You squeeze it and it squirts out. Well, maybe there was a bubble up here, or maybe some kind of cavity, and these top layers are heavy, and so they're pushing down, and the bottom layer squirts up into this cavity where there was maybe a little air bubble or something. But what's that telling you about the bottom layer?
It's still soft.
Exactly, Alan. It's still soft. So if it had been there a million years, is it going to bubble up? I mean, even if it had been 100 years, it's solid by now, right? It's cementified. And so this has to have all been quickly, boom, boom, boom. And then maybe there's something that comes along and erodes off these top layers, and you're left with these really weird things called clastic dikes. We see these in different places in the world. Like, what is that? Piece of rock just naturally squirting up like that. Well, it's a clastic dike. See? And it was maybe a little bit harder than the top layer, so it didn't erode. But you have these clastic dikes that are kind of intruded from the lower layer, squirting up into the higher layer. And then distinct layers bent together. This is cool, it's my favorite. Let's say you have a whole bunch of layers, and then an earthquake happens or a landslide, and they all bend together. Now, what's that telling you about them? They're all soft at the same time. Because if the bottom one had been there a million years, would it bend like that? Snap, right? So here they are all bending together. Look, there's a whole mountain of bent layers. Check this out. There's a dude up there. Can you see that guy up there for scale? Can somebody say amen? I love this stuff, man. Catastrophe. Mr. Evolutionist, can you show me somewhere on the face of the earth this is happening today? I mean, we can't imagine the scale of the catastrophe that would make those layers, turn them up on end, and bend them all together. Mind-boggling power and forces of nature that we have never seen in our lifetimes. Look at these mountains of bent layers. And so what is the fossil record? It's billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. Basically, the whole fossil record is a gigantic monument to the Genesis flood. Okay, then we have ooparts. What is an oopart? An oopart is an out-of-place artifact. It's something that shouldn't be where it is. And here we see a hammer. Now, I've got a replica of this. The original's in safe deposit in Texas. The Hahn family was walking along a river in Texas, and they saw a piece of wood sticking out of a rock. They thought, well, that's weird. So they got a chisel, they whacked it open, and lo and behold, the wood was the handle of a hammer. Now, you have to understand the rock layer in that part of Texas has dinosaur remains in it, dinosaur tracks and dinosaur bones. So obviously, the people weren't living at the time of the dinosaurs, so there must have been a dinosaur that was making hammers. A hammersaurus. We just haven't discovered him yet. And he left his hammer there. No, I mean, obviously people lived at the same time as the dinosaurs, right? And whoever built the hammer missed the boat. An out-of-place artifact. That's a problem for the evolutionists. Guy named Newton Anderson, 1944, World War II time frames. His job was to get the coal and put it in the coal furnace. And he goes to his coal furnace in West Virginia, and he has a big lump of coal, and he's opening the coal furnace, and the coal kind of bobbles, falls on the concrete floor, and breaks in half. He sees something sticking out of it. He's like, what's that? Puts it off to the side, puts the rest of the coal on. The next morning he goes down, gets a croquet mallet, whacks at it, and extracts a bell out of the coal. Now, the coal's supposed to be 300 million years old, before even the time of the dinosaurs. You don't even have a bellosaurus going to bail you out on this one. Obviously, a pre-flood artifact. This bell was analyzed at the University of Oklahoma. It is a brass bell with an iron clapper that goes ding-ding-ding inside of it. Well, Genesis chapter 4, verse 22 says Tubal-Cain was an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. That was the two metals they were using in the pre-flood world. Here you got a brass bell with an iron clapper. It's buried in coal because it got stuck in a bunch of vegetation, got swept down. It's a relic of the pre-flood world, an out-of-place artifact. Human footprints in very old limestone that they're not supposed to be alive yet at the time. These are problems for evolutionists. Now, sometimes the evolutionists like to turn the tables and say, well, we got a problem for you guys. If evolution didn't happen, how come we got this general order of this fossil record? Remember, we talked about this in the beginning. They like this. How come you've got invertebrates, then fish, and then reptiles, then mammals, and birds, if everything just kind of all got buried one time in a flood? Who knows the answer? Yes?
Because the fish were there at the bottom of the ocean, so they got it first, and then the dinosaurs and crocodiles in the swampy areas, and they got it next.
Excellent. You're putting the pieces together here. Remember how the floodwater was coming up? Okay, this is just the order that things are buried in, right? And in some cases, these guys are a little bit dumber. They're kind of, duh. And some of these things are running to higher ground. And what's the last thing that's going to be buried in a flood? The birds, right? So this makes perfect sense from a creationist perspective. Habitat, intelligence, mobility, body density is the answer to the question. Here is Emmy Clark. He built a flume apparatus. He puts sand and some silt and some rocks and some fossils. He swirls it all around, and he gets it moving real good. And lo and behold, the heaviest things settle at the bottom, and then the smaller things. And the silt takes days sometimes, and it just naturally forms these layers. Here's another puzzle that the evolutionists like to throw at creationists. They say, in Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone, we see lots of layers. And there's a forest that gets buried. Another forest grows, that gets buried. Another forest grows, gets buried. There's 27 different forests there. Can you explain how 27 different forests could all form during the 1 year of Noah's flood? And for a long time, we didn't have a good answer for this one. And I tell you this just to say, we're never going to have all the answers for everything. I mean, it takes time to figure things out, and some puzzles we may never have the answer to. Okay? But that shouldn't bother us because we don't have some answer. That's the nature of science. You learn more with time. And I'm going to come back to this, but I'm just going to throw that out there for a minute And I'm going to come back to that and explain it in just a minute. But I want to take a minute and explain the Grand Canyon. Anybody been to the Grand Canyon? Yeah, isn't it amazing? If you haven't been, you got to go. It's just, I stood there with my family at sunrise in the Grand Canyon. I just began to sing, "Oh, Lord, my God." And people looking at me kind of weird. My kids like, Dad, you know. It's awesome. Like, it's just mind-bogglingly amazing. You can't describe it. Even a picture doesn't do it justice, right? Massive. But what made this? Well, the evolutionists want you to tell you that it takes millions of years for this Colorado River to erode out the Grand Canyon. Two problems with that. Number one, it's the wrong kind of river. It's a meandering river. Meandering rivers don't erode through rock. It's the kind that goes straight down a mountain, whoosh, to cut out rock. So it's the wrong kind of river. Number two, Grand Canyon's actually a mountain. It's the Kaibab Plateau. And the Kaibab Plateau is a mountain. To see the Grand Canyon, you got to go up, 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 and you look down in the canyon. Well, the Colorado River comes into the canyon here at 2,800 foot elevation. The canyon goes up to 8,000 foot elevation. How come the Colorado River didn't just pool up and go around? How come it climbed over the mountain and eroded it? It makes no sense. Rivers don't go straight up a mountain and erode it away. So I think the Grand Canyon formed as a result of the flood water running off the earth. Back when the layers were still soft and the water's running off, it's forming this canyon. It's forming it in days. You say, "Dave, really? You're going to form the Grand Canyon in days?" Yeah. Catastrophes do things fast. How many of you heard of Mount St. Helens? The explosion. On 1980, May 17th, this is what the mountain looked like in beautiful Washington State. And then the mountain had a temper tantrum. And the whole north slope began to slide down. And then the mountain looked like this. And then it looked like this. And then I wouldn't want to be the dude taking these pictures. Lots of force coming, exploding out. All this debris going down the side of the mountain. Well, at the base of Mount St. Helens, there's a beautiful lake called Spirit Lake. The lake has a river called the Toutle River coming out of it. And the Toutle River got blocked with all this debris, mud and ash, and even trees getting blown down the side of the mountain. And so for a while, it looked really like, moonscape, like no grass, no trees, looked like the moon. But they got blocked. And so the river water went up, 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 till finally the water got so high, it crested the top of the dam, and it started to go through, whoosh. And because these layers were all still soft, it eroded in short order, like literally in minutes, it eroded a canyon. The canyon is 1,000 feet wide, 140 feet deep, 1/20th scale model of the Grand Canyon, and it happened in minutes. We know because people saw it. Look at this. You see this layer, then this layer, then this layer. You might think those layers took millions of years to form, but we know better because we were there. Interestingly, the force of the blast of Mount St. Helens knocked all the trees in this area into the lake. And they're all floating around in this lake in a mass of literally millions and millions of logs. And the creationists are a little bit curious, so they came to check this out. They noticed that there's a lot of the logs that are floating upright. Well, that's because the root balls are heavier and they get waterlogged, and so it kind of goes like bloop, like that. And eventually the whole thing gets waterlogged and goes all to the bottom of the lake, right? And here's the creationists. They put on scuba gear, and you see the mountain still smoking in the background. Some creationists are a little crazy, like the people that hunt for dinosaurs. And here they are, scuba around in the lake, and lo and behold, they find at the bottom these trees that are standing straight upright, like as if they were planted. But there's there's some root balls, but the roots don't go out really because they've been sheared off. And then the dust and the debris happens, and then another one settles out, and then maybe some more layers, then, oh. And now, because of Mount St. Helens, we understood what happened at Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone. Those 27 layers of supposed forest are just trees settling out during the flood at different layers, along with the debris and the dust and the dirt that's settling out. And we have the answer, because we observed it happening at Mount St. Helens. What I'm telling you, folks, is we're never going to have all the answers, but our faith is a very reasonable faith. But you got to have faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please him, for he that comes to God must believe that he is, and he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Have you believed in God? Have you believed in his word? If you haven't believed in God's word, the first thing you need to do is take God at his word, and you need to understand that before God, you're a sinner. And before God, you stand judged and condemned for your wrongdoing, and I do as well, and we all need a Savior. And then by faith, we can take Jesus Christ as our Savior. Jesus is talking about the time of the flood, and he said this, as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and knew not till the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Jesus said the same way it was in the pre-flood world is how it's going to be in the end times. People are going to be oblivious to the message of truth. They didn't believe Noah until the rain started happening. Maybe you've witnessed to somebody and they just didn't want any part of it. Right, Dee? And maybe you've invited your friends or your neighbors to church and they just, no, I don't want to hear about it. And they're busy, not always with really bad stuff, they're just busy with life. Eating and drinking and giving in marriage. Does that sound like what's going on around about us? See, we need to be faithful just like Noah was. Because the reality is there's going to come a time, again, God is going to judge the world. One of the fascinating tiny little details as I studied the flood account that jumped out at me was this. In Genesis chapter 7, verse 16, the Bible says the Lord shut him in. God closed the door. We got a little door on this ark here. You can see it. They got a big door in the one out in Kentucky. But why did God close the door? Did you ever think about that? Why do you think, I mean, I would think Noah would have closed the door when time came to get on the boat. Why did God close it?
Noah would have felt sorry for people.
Noah would have felt sorry for people. That's what occurred to me. Can you imagine? These are Noah's brothers, maybe nephews, nieces, cousins. And he told them the truth all those years and they didn't believe him. Now they're coming up. Noah, we believe you now. We want to come on. Oh, he's got a big heart. He'd probably go, no, we got lots of space here. We got lots of food. You know, Mrs. Noah, open up the door. Let a few of them in, you know. Let cousin Jimmy in. But God closed the door. God said, you guys had your chance. And God closed it solid. And my friends, watch this. Watch this right here. In Luke 13:25, Jesus says this, when once the master of the house has risen up and has shut to the door, and you begin to stand without and to knock at the door, saying, Lord, Lord, open unto us. And he shall answer and say unto you, I know you not whence you are. My friends, this is reality. The day is going to come where God's going to close the door again on a whole generation. This may be our relatives. This may be your unsaved dad or mom. This may be your friends at work. This may be your neighbors down the street. See, this is serious. Satan wants us to be distracted with eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage. And we're dealing with eternity and with precious souls. Noah was faithful, even though nobody believed him. Talk about a dysfunctional community. Like nobody even heard him. Like nobody, not one converted. Just his family. And he stayed with it and persisted for 100 years. This is awful. Talk about a toxic environment. Nobody believes him. Nobody trusts him and listens. But he was faithful. How are you doing? Are you being faithful where God has put you? Are you being salt and light right here in the Rochester community? Yes, it's maybe tough times. You don't have a pastor. Yes, you're going through some difficulties. Yes, this is going on and that's going on. It's always the case and always has been, always will be. But are you being faithful right now to be a witness to those round about you who will someday be standing knocking on the outside? Every head bowed, every eye closed. I want to just close in prayer before I turn it over to JR. Nobody's looking around. In the quietness of the moment, I want to ask you a simple question. Have you been faithful? Or would you honestly say, Dave, you know, I feel some conviction. I know I need to be a better witness. I need to be a better testimony. And I can think of some people right now that I just maybe have given up on, or maybe God pricked my heart, but I haven't testified to, that I need to invite them to church. I need to give them a tract. I need to build that relationship and just give them the gospel. I know we all need to do a better job, but maybe this morning you're going to say, Dave, before God, with nobody looking around, I just want to raise my hand in testimony that I am committing to be a better witness for Jesus. Is there anybody like that? Just, I see those hands. Okay, you can put them back down. Anybody else? I see that hand. Thank you. I see that hand. Thank you. Anybody else? See that hand? Thank you, sir. God in heaven, you saw these hands. Lord, my hand is up with these. I need to be a better witness. Lord, would you help us? God, we get distracted with eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, just the stuff of this world, with jobs and with hobbies and with so many things, and we lose the eternal perspective that we're dealing with souls that are going to live somewhere forever, many of them apart from you. God, we have been given the opportunity to be an influence, maybe in a dysfunctional home, maybe in a dysfunctional workplace, maybe in just a bad, toxic neighborhood. Lord, and God, may we have that focus that this is where you put us, to be salt and light for right now. God, none of us is going to be here forever. We're going to go to someplace else. We're not destined to be here. We're sons and daughters of the King. But Lord, you've allowed us, like Noah, to be here, and if nothing else, just to have testified so they have no excuse. But maybe, God, to save some, to plant a seed, maybe to water a seed. Lord, would you give some people a divine inability to sleep at night till they reach souls? Lord, maybe just wake them up so that they'll be crying out to you and get out of their bed and get on their knees and start praying for somebody to be saved, Lord. Give us a sense of urgency for the things that matter, I pray. In the name of Jesus, amen.